Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Series. My name is Abbas Dhilawala, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Galen Data, and I'll be your host today. Today, we'll be hearing from Andrew Wu, General Manager of APAC and VP of Medical Software for Rook Quality Systems, for a conversation on data management and performance monitoring in AI-enabled devices. We'll discuss some best practices for data management, post-market monitoring, predetermined change control plans, and much more. But first, a few housekeeping items and a little information on Galen Data. So Galen Data is an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, CE marks, and other standards. We're ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is HITRUST certified. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, our goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of cost while shaving months of the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics before we start the webinar. As we are going through this webinar, if you have any questions, you can type those in the Q&A section, which should be in your sidebar, either on the left or the right, depending on your client. We'll be asking those questions to Andrew at the end, or if it's appropriate, I'll bring up those during our conversation. There's also some handouts on that same control panel with more information on Galen Data and a white paper on cloud connectivity. Also, a reminder that a copy of this webinar will be sent to you via email, most likely tomorrow. That being said, I would like to introduce our guest, Andrew Wu. Welcome, Andrew. Andrew has about 15 years experience in medical device and diagnostic industry. He brings deep expertise in technical development, quality systems, and regulatory strategy, particularly in the SAMD space. He has led numerous verification and validation efforts for embedded medical device, software, and regulated environment, and a strong record of guiding teams through complexities of international market access, and a deep background in AI-enabled software devices, or AI-enabled devices in general. So welcome, Andrew. Maybe start with a quick introduction to Rook Quality Systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Abbas, for having me. So just a quick intro about the firm. Rook Quality System is headquartered in Atlanta since 2012, and the APAC office was established in Taiwan since 2020. The Rook Quality System has helped our clients secure multiple AI ML-enabled CMD clearances in the US, ranging from wearable devices to medical imaging post-processing application and many others. So we have about 20 software quality assurance engineers and experienced subject matter expert who can serve as your advisor consultant on all the quality regulatory matters. So we're more than happy to chat with you. And so do not hesitate to reach out via our website or email provided on the slide and at the end of our presentation as well. So thank you for having me.
Cool. So let's start with the kind of the general outline of what we will be discussing on these webinars. So we'll start with outlining some challenges that are very unique to AI-enabled medical devices. We'll talk about privacy and security of data, because data is what drives a lot of the AI. We'll talk about good machine learning practices that should be used in AI-enabled medical devices, and then factors that affect kind of post-market model performances and how they can impact your business and QMSs. And then we'll follow that up with some best practices on model monitoring and addressing privacy and security of data. And then Andrew will share some case studies on an AI-enabled medical device, and we'll also talk about the Predetermined Change Control Plan, a new tool set that the FDA has relatively newly released for AI developers. So let's dig in. I wanted to kind of talk through some challenges. Obviously, any medical device development has plenty of challenges, from regulatory, from technical, from clinical. But AI devices, or AI-enabled medical devices, to be more specific, have some additional challenges that are very unique to that model. And so we wanted to kind of lay those down before we start going into some specifics. So one example is that the algorithms, which is the core of your medical device, may perform differently in a clinical setting and in a real world condition. Now that happens with other medical devices. A lot of time things work in clinical settings but don't work in the same way in a kind of real world exercise. but the delta can be much bigger in an AI system because for many reasons. One could be that your training is done on a data set that's very different compared to what real world conditions are. You'll have drift, and we'll talk about some drifts later on that you don't necessarily see in a non-AI enabled medical devices. Change management is necessary to account for that drift. Again, we don't think of change management. We have to think about change management differently in AI-enabled medical devices than we have to in, let's say, a traditional medical devices, because you may need to change to conform back to what your stated performance was, versus making a change to make things different or make add functionality. Regulation is still evolving, so that's another thing. In traditional medical devices, we had regulations for a few decades now. There's good practices, there is good guidances both from the FDA, but also from European regulators and other regulators around the world. AI is still evolving. Regulation is still evolving with it. There's unclear parts on how things will work or not work, so those add additional challenges. And end users are adopting, right? People know what AI is, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable always in understanding how that works, specifically in a context of medical care. So we need additional validation. We need initial ways to kind of comfort the usage and adopt that usage, and also to understand the challenges and the limitations that come with an AI-enabled devices. And then, as usual, cybersecurity is top of mind on many things, and AI models have some unique risk, and we'll talk about those risks that affect those models. So we'll have Andrew and I go through some of these challenges over the next 30-ish minutes. Let's talk about one is just again a background on what privacy and security regulations exist or why we need them in a medical device in general, regardless of whether it's AI or not. So obviously we have existing laws and regulations that require protecting sensitive data. They exist pre-AI, but they also become they're applicable on AI systems as well. And it's really more important in AI just because the amount of data we consume and the transformation of that data that happens, which may not always be one-to-one, right? So we have HIPAA and we have GDPR, for example, two major privacy regulations, one in the US, one in Europe, but really applicable in many contexts. And so we need to understand that and make sure that when we develop AI systems, that we are still cognizant of those laws. We still have, this is a problem across medical devices, is the definition of what a PHI and what penalties are if we don't protect the PHI are very different. And so the aim is to protect the privacy of patient and user. And so those different regimes have to be reconciled. There's still not a global standard, unfortunately, for privacy management of PHI or any kind of sensitive data. Data breaches can have serious consequences, including loss of sensitive information, but also financial penalties. Those are kind of financial problems, but there's a big reputational damage that can happen that could potentially kill your business if financial penalties don't kill you by default. So very important to consider privacy and secure data in any medical device development, but becomes much more pronounced in a system that is so data hungry. So it's always paramount to consider that throughout your pipeline. So throughout, and Andrew will talk about some of the pipelines, but through data ingestions to all the way to presentation to make sure that you consider how you're protecting the data and how are you maintaining the privacy of any sensitive information. Andrew, do you want to talk about some good machine learning practices?
Yeah, of course. So let's look at this diagram. I'm sure the audience has seen this before. This diagram basically explains how the FDA and some other regulatory authority design the regulatory review process, like to really address the post-market monitoring requirement for ML systems. So if you look at the different color blocks, right? The blue blocks indicate the pre-production processes at a higher level, right? And gray blocks indicate the post-production processes, and the orange blocks indicate the regulatory review process. Okay, I won't dig into the detail because I'm sure you guys have seen it before, and there are plenty of information online that you can review. Can we go to the next slide, please, Abbas?
Sure.
Thank you. All right, so I tried
Sorry.
to over. The previous one, yeah, this one, yeah. So I try to overlay the three pipelines that Abbas mentioned earlier, just as an approximation on how to explain this process. Obviously, a lot of this, the pipeline can kind of span across different processes, but I try to put in a location where it occupies most of the activities. Right? So that's make some distinction between those three pipelines. Okay, so these three pipelines are the data pipeline, which is where you try to curate, contextualize your data assets, and provide these as output to initiate an ML pipeline. So obviously that's from the very beginning, and you got to do, manage your data set selection, splitting very accurately based on what FDA asks you to do. Right? Machine learning pipeline is where you train, evaluate, tune, package, compile, deploy, service your model. Okay. And the software dev pipeline is essentially where you embed, integrate a machine learning algorithm as part of your software system. Okay. So you can see that, when your data pipeline is initiated, you got your training data in, going to the machine learning ops. In the machine learning ops, you go through training, tuning, and eventually internal, external validation. There will be some criteria that you have to evaluate against, including accuracy, for instance, reliability, repeatability, clinical evaluation, etc. And once everything is done, once you think your model is ready, you embed it as part of your software, which can be an interface with the typical endpoint at a hospital system, where you basically integrate your model into your software, and then you deploy the model right alongside with your software. And the orange blocks is essentially what the FDA proposed to manage and review, either from a pre-market point of view on your product certification process, but also the real world performance monitoring, which is going to be our focus. So, the talk today is going to focus on the bottom right? And then that model monitoring block, um, and that feedback loop for data, for retraining, and some change management process that we're going to initiate to ensure that the model is performing as intended. Okay, so next slide, we're going to talk about, why model performance can be affected by numerous factors, right? I think this is the obvious question that you guys have. The reason is quite simple. If you think about the ML model, is basically constituted by notes and weights, right? They simply put, in technical terms, the weights are associated with the connection between the nodes. So the weight would dynamically shift it or adjust it based on the production data inputs. So in a nutshell, the data coming in, the inference data that's coming into your model would change your model, right? And why does that occur? But that's, dig into the definitions, right? And obviously there are multiple drift that we're talking about. The highest level is model drift. Model drift refers to the decrease in model quality, and this can be caused by various reasons, which I laid out here. From a regulator's perspective, they would like to enforce med device manufacturer to anticipate and address the impact of a model drift to ensure the safety efficacy of the medical device claim are still achieved. So obviously first you wanted to figure out what's the root cause of a model drift, right? So this can be caused by a data drift. So this refers to what Abbas was saying, the change in distribution of the model inputs. Meaning that the data that you received in the production environment deviates from the data that was initially trained for, right? So in a nutshell, your model is not trained to perform as intended with those production data, right? So this can be caused by both a data set specific, delta or deviation, right? Some demographic differences, or even if we're talking about medical imaging stuff, like some scanner spec differences across different institutions can cause, this data distribution delta. Or it can be caused by data schema or data management practice deviation across different sites, right? So obviously that's something that can cause data drift quite often. And the second is the concept drift. This is actually in the context of a medical device, concept drift is less frequent. because this happens when the product is being used off-label, right? Meaning that if the device claim to achieve something, achieve certain clinical indication, but it's not intend to do something else, but the user obviously wanted to use it for various workflow, perhaps, and they try to go off-label, then the model might experience a concept drift, meaning that what it outputs might not really mean, like might not really refer to that prediction that the manufacturer intend to produce, right? So this is less frequent, just to emphasize. Okay, data drift is obviously a lot more frequent. Training servicing skew. So this is referred to like apparent mismatch on the training and production data shortly after the model in production use. This happens when you launch the model, when you deploy the model initially, because it obviously takes time for the model to adapt. Right? The data quality problem, data could be corrupted. Incomplete data is not flagged in time. So the prediction output might deteriorate. Outlier detection, if the outlier are not flagged in time, then the prediction output can no longer be estimated. The drift detector, like the drift, a data drift detector might evaluate the overall model reliability, but outlier detector really helps you discover the inputs that the model might be ill-equipped to handle, right? So this might be a one-off. This might be a very complex case or even like an outlier case where your medical imaging acquisition is not follow through that protocol very precisely and cause some imaging characteristic that's so different from others, right? The prediction drift it refers to a change in data outputs. Okay. So under most circumstances, right, the ground truth label are not accessible. That's why the ML model is in place to give you that prediction, right? But we're going to talk about some of the design consideration where you can allow the user to interact with the model, where the manufacturer can keep collecting that ground truth label when the opportunity comes, and that can really optimize their data. That's part of the monitoring suggestion that we typically implement. But essentially, what we're trying to do here is detect. We're trying to kind of convey here is detecting, addressing data drift or any other cause to the model performance deterioration is very crucial, right? To ensure that ML model reliability in the real world setting it's upkeep. Upkeep. Okay, next slide, please. So essentially, a generalized model can be observed with the behavior when you both observe both the feature and the prediction drift without a decay in model quality over deployment, right? It's common to see that there would be some drift, but the drift wouldn't be causing the model to deteriorate over time because obviously each model would have to be adapted to each site of deployment. Okay, so I just want to emphasize that drift is not necessarily a bad thing. Drift is actually very common, but as long as the model quality is, it's not decaying to the extent that the model it's not really meeting the acceptance criteria that you propose to the FDA, then there is no issue. Okay, but how do you do that is the focus of this talk. Okay. Right, so let's dig into the impact on the business. Why does data management and post-market monitoring matter? Right? And obviously, we're speaking from the quality regulatory team's perspective. You gotta obviously observe whether there is some customer complaint on the performance of the algorithm. So you potentially need to issue CAPAs or reporting to authorities regarding its safety. It can be a public-facing labeling changes or even escalated as a warning. You have to conduct risk evaluation, which might lead to design changes. And obviously, you've got to determine whether QMS is adequate. Right? But there are impact on other functions within the business as well. The management responsibilities, from their perspective, how do I ensure that the ML algorithm, the ML model, is still being used at a regular basis so that they can keep generating revenues and hit the business KPIs? Sometime per use cases, these ML model can be abandoned by the user, right? And that could be caused by the lack of post-market monitoring because you don't know why. It might be a model drift, it might be a performance deterioration, it might be something else. But you gotta know why. You gotta investigate what's the root cause of that. Right? From a customer support perspective, they gotta identify whether the product might be non-conforming and why that is and try to collect more information. From the ML team perspective, they have to evaluate the root cause of any observed model degradation and propose remediation solutions that leads to design changes, design validation. Obviously, that's what the regulatory quality team would be combined force to do as well. IT operation, this is a big part of it, and I'm sure Abbas have a lot of experience and case to share. The IT operation actually serves as a very important function to upkeep and design a good, effective post-market monitoring solution, which can serve the company across function within the company fairly well. Everybody needs their own data point to make judgments to ensure that they are performing to to achieve what their respective function needs to achieve. Right. So there is a various aspect, not just regulatory quality team is impacted by this. Abbas, do you have anything else to add to this
I
topic?
will add a couple. I mean, one is it does impact your sales potentially, right? So again, you mentioned abandoning the usage. Especially, it's still a very new model to sell from a sales perspective to sell a AI-enabled medical device. There's still acceptance that needs to be created at various institutions, and so a bad performing model can potentially kill adaptability in that institution, but also other places. And so it's very important upfront, especially when you're trying to get this into healthcare systems or wherever you're trying to sell it into, that you have a very constantly monitored and then you're able to react to those kind of degradation that may happen or other impacts that may happen into your product because there's a lot of evaluation and a lot of kind of your future sales may depend on kind of an acceptance early on with some key stakeholders. So there's a business case there, and then from an IT perspective, obviously you need an architectural kind of management of data to support the other aspect, right? So quick logging, making sure that the uh, model is both performant from a prediction perspective, but also from a kind of timely perspective that gives you the timely outputs. And so there's more than monitoring. You can add additional monitoring, not just the performance of the model, but other aspects of usage to be able to detect some of those KPIs. To make sure that the abandonment can be detected quickly, right? So you see a drop in usage, you see a drop in a certain kind of query, um, and then also we'll probably talk about some of these around cybersecurity. So monitoring around cybersecurity. So you can combine a monitoring system that monitors across different attributes, but
Mhm.
the main being, obviously the model performance because that impacts on essentially your product.
Thanks, Abbas. This is helpful. Can we move on to next slide, please? Thank you. All right, just briefly cover impact on the quality management system. Right, so we try to lay out the relevant provisions from CFR Part 820. These are the relevant provisions that you have to think about on the post-market monitoring perspective for ML systems. And the last bullet point is actually something that an expert from the latest FDA guidance. FDA, in fact, introduced this concept into the guidance, basically saying that quality system regulation regarding adequate ongoing performance might subject to market submission review and support determination of substantial equivalence, meaning that if you're going after a 510K clearance, the ongoing performance, which is governed by adequate post-market monitoring schema that you have and plan that you have, it would actually determine whether you can receive product certification or not. So they have made it super clear. And there are where PCCP guidance And PCCP guidance initially was implemented only for ML devices and then later expanded to all the software related devices. And with this provision, I think it really is not, it's an understatement that the post-market monitoring is really a focus area that the FDA is looking at right now. Okay, so this is just a slide referring to a provision that you might have to think about. Right. We're going to talk about in the next slide, which is typical tier-based monitoring setup that we help our client implement. So we'll start from the bottom, right? So technical monitoring. So what does that mean, right? So these metric, typically logged by the system to ensure a lot of these non-functional requirements, right? Such as operational performance, scaling, latency are addressed. For instance, we track the data traffic and resources required for data processing and gathering, monitoring the rates of data rejection or any other errors. Like Abbas was saying, there will be plenty of logs that you leverage to understand the model, operation, or even on the cybersecurity implication. Right? You monitor the rates of, the timeliness, resources required for data gathering, processing, etc. So there will be, plenty of information that you can get from these technical monitoring metrics to understand how your model is, whether it's still in an operational state or it's really, reaching the margin where it could cause, some situation to happen in a short term and you can try to prevent it from happening. Abbas, do you have anything else to add here?
One I will add is cost. Always monitor cost because it affects your baseline, affects your bottom line. But no, the AI models, they are very resource hungry. They can be made less resource hungry, but generally are resource hungry, specifically if they're doing a lot of the kind of gathering enough information also as they are performing. So just always monitor cost. But yeah, other than that, I think you covered everything else.
Yeah, the cost is actually one of the PCCP modifications that we were worrying about for one of our case client, and we're going to talk about it, the reduction on the computation resources as one of the examples. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So we move on to the third tier, which would be the model performance evaluation at so-called the population-based performance analysis. And the second tier would be model performance evaluation at the subgroup or case performance level evaluation. Right? And I'll explain what the distinction between those two tiers. So we help our clients set up, off-the-shelf dashboard with performance alerts, data drift alerts, data integration alerts, etc. And based on the threshold and metrics defined, you will then receive different type of alerts. Right? You then can prioritize alerts and reporting, for population-based performance on a regular basis. It can be biweekly, it can be monthly, it can be at a quarterly basis, up to your clients and up to the medical device manufacturer's perspective. So at the model level, right, you can use specific analytical tool to inspect alerts and determine whether you would like to investigate the root cause and propose remediation. And obviously there are examples here where you look at the data input metrics, the ML model metrics, and prediction drift metrics. I give some examples here. So you can investigate, performance drift due to whatever underlying reason that is. You can also leverage a standard like quality control test set, which is kind of like re-examining the model performance based off a standard quality control test to kind of evaluate the performance baseline. At the event level, right, meaning that at each instance of a flagging, you can look at certain subgroup. For instance, if there is a certain clinical case that's relatively very difficult for your algorithm to perform, then obviously you will pick up those relevant cases and try to do subgroup analysis. And that's what the FDA asks you to do. During the pre-market evaluation, they ask you to determine, what are the confounding factors that affect the model performance, and to ensure that the bias are really addressed. Obviously results in a more generalized model across different institutions, different environments. So the second tier, what we're trying to kind of convey here is you should certainly look at, those event logs and really inspect the instances where there might be certain data input distribution deviation for certain subgroup data or certain cases, right? Sometime that one deviation case might throw off things. And if you try to take it out from the log, perhaps the model drift is not that severe, right? But you got to understand why, like what causes it, right? There might be instances where initially we didn't think, a particular machine at one site can cause the data drift. But we later found out that in the DICOM header, there would be some information that we read that really throw off that initial trained model because of certain parameters from that DICOM header, right? And a lot of time that's, it could be a little surprising observation or surprising investigative results. So we just, I think this is an area that I'm sure most of our clients and audience today would like to really think about it, right? And lastly, we'd like to talk about that top tier, which is oftentimes the most difficult to monitor. Is the user behavior and human so-called AI or ML model interaction, right? This is actually referred by the FDA in the guidance, but it required very early planning into your design. For instance, you can build a agree with AI or agree with ML model button for allowing your user to select whether they do agree or disagree with the data for continuous monitoring to, in a way, keep collecting the ground truth data by the expert users. Significant increase in agreement may indicate over reliance on the model, right? And you can also track how often these prediction results from an ML model are actively being viewed by the user. Sometimes even if the model is deployed, they actually don't look at the prediction data as much. And you've got to figure out why, right? And sometimes you've got to track instances where the use is outside of device approval use scenario, which is also a little bit tough to do. We mostly do through try to enforce that through labeling control, the model card, just to confine that use case from the really from the regulatory perspective, right? But there would be instances where you would like to constrain that your device is being used under certain clinical workflow, but not the others, right? Or you might want to detect whether the users are cherry picking cases, for less complex cases, for instance, right? And if that happens, then, what's your value proposition for the user then, right? If the difficult case cannot be reliant with your model, are you suggesting that the less complex case using your model can save time, and does that really add value to the client? It really depends on how you want to position your model, but there would be actually multiple parameters you can try to capture and observe how the user is interacting with your ML model instead of any passive, relatively more passive model performance metric. So we encourage our client to think about it quite a lot, and it does seem like FDA is in agreement with that proactive measurements. Okay. Right. Let's move on to just a high level workflow. I think we already talked about it a lot, but just to summarize it, 4 distinctive steps. First, monitoring, and perhaps if you can have a real-time alert. Obviously, that can be a very time-consuming thing to, or not even a feasible thing to set up. But the alerts can be categorical, like we said. The alerts is based on model event or event level observations, model level and event level observations, right? And then you try to investigate root cause based on both model level and event level observations. Sorry about the typo. And you will be introducing remediations, whether the model needs to be retrained, calibrated, reconfigured, or even data pipeline needs to be optimized or additional data needs to be collected, and then deployments, right? It will be label updates, it will be repackaged, the deployment of a model, for instance. So this is just kind of a very general workflow. But what we suggest our client to think about is design the most feasible post-market surveillance approach within your organization, right? Different size organization do it differently. Obviously, different product profile would affect how you want to do it. So there are a lot of consideration here, in fact. And like Abbas was saying, this does impact your business case quite a lot, right? So it's no longer just a regulatory quality issue. You can really get some feedback from the customer interaction with your model based off this setup. Okay, so let's dig into a case study. Okay, and we'll move on to the Q&A session. Close out by Abbas and move on to Q&A session. So this is a case study from Dr. Thitipat's lab from Mediheal University in Thailand to demonstrate why data management and monitoring can be crucial for optimizing ML algorithm. So the cranial next, or in short, CRA next, CRA-next, is an ML algorithm intended to generate customized shape skull implant from the defected skull CT scan. So the ML algorithm is initially validated with mostly synthetic data and just some clinical data set, and it's validated based off evaluation metrics commonly accepted by regulatory authority for segmentation task, which I list in the next slide, such as the DICE score, Hall-Serve distance, that's based off the voxel by voxel evaluation. False positive in this particular case refer to the additional predicted region, right? Or the surplus segmentation of the implant. False negative refer to the missing prediction or the missed segmentation area, right? So these are the metric that's commonly used for segmentation task with the FDA and other authorities as well. Okay. And next slide, we're going to talk about some of the qualitative criteria based on the clinical workflow, right? It can be defined as complete coverage of the implant over defective area without any gaps or holes. Okay. The implant is fit to the defective area without any additional predicted region or surplus segmentation. It will cause an issue with the fit. And the implant should resemble the shape of the skull. It shouldn't give you a very weird shape. The implant edge should be compatible with the defective edge, and the implant thickness should be acceptable clinically for surgical operation. Right? So these are some of the qualitative prediction and criteria that they defined from this research study. And we'd like to introduce two modifications from a example predetermined change control plan based off some of these criteria that we talked about. Okay. So the first example is we'd like to retrain with some boundary clinical data sets. Like I said, the initial training was mostly synthetic data set from the skull break data set. The artificial defect from the skull break data set, those synthetic ones, were injected by subtracting random generated shapes. And only 5 different defects. And in fact, skull defect can be caused by, there are numerous, I think a dozen different types of defect that's not being covered by this artificial defect data set. The defect border were smooth with the morphological operation, from this randomly subtraction It's just the limitation of how you generate artificial defect. It cannot resemble that actual, break that break interface fairly well, right? So obviously, we want to retrain with the boundary clinical data sets, with the original trained synthetic data set. So defect would be more diverse from various etiology, due to brain tumors, traumatic brain injury, decompressive craniotomy, all these type of different etiology actually cause different type of defects. And with this additional boundary clinical data set being incorporated, then we can then generalize this model to a broader, use case, use circumstances. So obviously, before retraining, there will be steps that you need to do, and this is what you need to cover in the PCCP as well. You got to standardize alignments with the two data sets, right? Before you train anything, you got to make sure that you have a good data management practice. You got to kind of comb your data, right? So here we try to do registration and cropping so that alignment is right across two data sets. And next slide, we're going to talk about some other consideration that we demonstrate to the FDA before we group all these two data sets together before the retraining occurs. So we put together a comparison of two data sets of some of the image properties and some of the acquisition properties of the machine. It's not shown here, but we demonstrate that. And we try to give defect definition differences and voxel occupancy rate, which is a crucial parameter in this particular clinical scenario. So we try to tell the FDA that there might be some differences between, but these are justifiable differences, and we can certainly achieve the performance enhancement on some of the boundary cases by incorporating some additional clinical data sets. Okay. So we got to prep and justify that additional data set does allow us to improve, on the model performance. Okay. So the result of this modification is obviously achieve a smoother transition at a defect site and better restore skull shape for various clinical etiology. They saw the reduced false positive rate and false negative rate on the voxel to voxel basis and reduced service Hausdorff distance. So that's a good thing because that compatibility of the implant to the skull defect, it's crucial, right, for them to really 3D print those implants. And clinical outcome, obviously, more satisfactory aesthetic outcome and some clinical benefits as well, which I'm not listing on this slide, but it's in the paper. Okay. So that move on to the second modification.
Before we go there, can I ask a quick
Please.
question on this?
Of
So
course.
this was the PCCP, right? So you had to, before you got the initial approval or the customer got the initial approval, they had to put in kind of the process of how
Correct.
they will retrain when they do get real data that they maybe don't have, or there's limitation of that data up front. Was there any concern in this approach that the FDA would push back and want to do that clinical trial before approval, or is this a pretty standard thing to kind of say a lot of synthetic data is acceptable as initial trained model, and then as long as you have a PCCP or some sort of model performance monitoring and change management practice in place to allow
Yeah.
you to do a lot with synthetic data?
Yeah, that's a great question, the boss. Um, in a nutshell, it really depends on your regulatory strategy. So if you choose a predicate device with certain claims and you're trying to demonstrate substantial equivalent to that, and if they're using synthetic data mostly for their training and that get the clearance, then there's actually a lot higher likelihood that you can try to follow through their steps and do so. Now, obviously, FDA can be more rigorous over time. So, in a nutshell, what we try to do is always approach the FDA with um, our validation proposals. Okay, so meaning that how much synthetic data we're using, why we're using these data sets. Obviously, Skullbreak, it's a very famous data set that's standardized, collected across different institutions. There's a standardized like process to do that, and actually it has been adopted for multiple like segmentation challenges across the board, right? So reliability of that data set, and then some clinical data set. So we got to demonstrate to the FDA that these data set are adequately from the sampling size perspective. And obviously there is some justification that we have to put together to justify that. But obviously more can be good, right? More data set can be good on general like sense, but more data set can also be very complex, right? So you gotta be cautious about how you demonstrate the subgroup analysis in front of FDA. So in a way, is the regulatory selection of PrEP device matters. I think that's kind of the most fundamental factor that I would like to introduce. And then second is how did they do validation? What's their data set like? And if you try to replicate with a similar number representative, then it should be okay. But obviously, like I said, FDA can be questioning and can be more rigorous over time so that you have to leverage pre-sub, get agreement with them, and get going. But we try not to ask our client to overstretch on the data set that they can collect. That can add numerous burden on their clinical like external validation processes, right? So uh, obviously I'm not answering about your
No, no, no.
question,
I think you gave me the idea of
but you
why.
got the general
It
idea.
depends. I mean, it's like anything, it depends.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. All right. So second modification, I'll run through it real quick. It's fairly simple. It's about cost. Okay. So there will be additional data pre-processing steps that we would like to introduce to achieve actually higher accuracy, but also reducing the computation required. Okay. So to achieve increased accuracy of the prediction, we adopt a skull template, which contain a anatomical location registered with the input of that the input skull model can be registered with, so that it gives a lot more semantic information for the model to remediate the difficult cases, such as prediction error due to bone growth, bone artifacts, calcification, and various other, imaging artifacts that would cause the segmentation engine to not perform as intended, right? So we adopt this skull template to achieve higher, accuracy of the prediction. Okay, and there are some model changes that we made in terms of the input resizing and foreground cropping, the encoder stage ratio. It's a very technical term. Was actually got allocated to a deeper stage of encoder, which allowed the network to read more descriptive features. We can gain accuracy of the reconstruction while there are a lot less, excuse me, a lot less parameter being used for the computation. Obviously, this have a quicker turnaround and also reduce the computation resources. Okay, so the result of this modification, I already mentioned, is increased accuracy and remediate difficult cases, and achieve a quicker turnaround time, reduce computational requirements. Okay, so this is just a quick example of how a PCCP can be structured. I think what's very, very important to emphasize at the end of the conversation today, obviously Abbas would have a lot more to add before we close, is the model might deteriorate over time, right? And you got to anticipate that, yeah, because FDA expect you to propose what's your remediating solution to them, which is why PCCP is in place. PCCP can allow you to not introduce new changes as a new application, or a special 510K, for instance. There will be a lot less regulatory burden on your side, to think about the change that you want to introduce to your model, right? So this can be a good tool for you to use, but obviously you got to set up your monitoring, setup right to really help you investigate the root cause. Might be doing some remediation trials and see if that helps with the performance, help with the business case, help with maybe other KPI across different function with your company, and achieve success on the post market monitoring scheme. Okay, that's all I have for today. Abbas, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. It was a great webinar. So we have about 9-ish minutes, so let's open up a Q&A. While the Q&A comes, so again, just a reminder, there's a panel in your GoToMeeting console that you can ask questions in. I already see a few questions coming in, but if you go ahead and ask the questions, and I will ask those questions to Andrew, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. If we can't, we'll definitely follow up lately. Just a reminder that this webinar the video of this will be emailed to you as well. So you can always go back and refer to the slides and stuff. And if you need slides, let us know. We can definitely send you those as well. The contact information for both us and Rook is on the screen. So if you have any other questions, please use those to reach out. So let's start with some questions that already come in. Andrew, um, there's quite a few questions around PCCP, so let's start with those. How flexible is the FDA, and what kind of changes can you make with PCCP? Can you use the PCCP to change your model's performance quite a bit? I'm not quite sure what model performance means here in this particular question, but maybe explain kind of the limitations of PCCP, because obviously you can't do everything there.
Yeah. If we, I think, if we think about what the FDA proposed in the guidance document in terms of like the modification protocol, I think there are four criteria. There are four categories: data management practice, retraining practice, performance evaluation, and update procedures. Okay. So data management practice refers to how your data can be collected, stored, quality assurance processes related to data. So a lot of like data corruption issue, missing data issues, stuff like that. There will be a better uh, kind of data ingestion pipeline, if you will, or data collection pipeline, if you will, to ensure your data is being, is being examined, before it goes to the model, right? Retraining practice where we talked about, there will be additional data set that you would like to, um, incorporate as part of your model training. There might be data sequestration strategies during retraining, uh, or certain drift happened like we talked about, and you want to retrain different data, right? Performance evaluation, we already also talk about it, right? What type of improvement that you're trying to achieve. I think the limitation here would be we try to avoid um, putting out new evaluation parameters that the FDA have not seen before. That can happen, uh, but we try to not to do that. For instance, like segmentation tool, a segmentation evaluation metric, it's for us is always size coefficient and Hausdorff distance. It can be based on a voxel to voxel basis. It can be, based off a slice to slice basis, or a 3D or 2D Hausdorff distance. There are multiple parameters that you evaluate during the pre-market, but we try not to introduce a new parameter because FDA would be asking what's happening with the original parameter that you're not letting us know the performance. Are you trying to say that you are utilizing additional parameter to evaluate your model, but the original parameter might not be showing much improvement or even might be deteriorating over time? Right. So it can happen. I mean, some companies try to push it through, but it's a harder justification. That's kind of one obvious limitation that I can think of. Operating procedure, I think, is a fairly simple, change, right? So There might be some changes on how the software is being updated, how the modification will be communicated, um, and yeah, so like how these performance changes should be consistent with the modification protocol, for instance, right? So that's the only instance I can think of, really. I'm sure there are many others, but that's the only thing I can think of as of now.
Right? Another question around PCCP is maybe an ROI question. So
Sure.
obviously the PCCP takes time to put together. So it is part of your initial submission that you have to provide this change control plan. And so a question here is, what's the ROI of doing that versus just coming back and doing a 510K? Um, that is obviously more flexible. You can change your claims in a 510K. You can't change your claims in a PCCP method. So time spent upfront putting a PCCP versus just doing the traditional ways. Like, is there an ROI data so far? Does it really solve? Does it really speed up kind of the overall process?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, a great way to put it. ROI really depends on how you anticipate your model to perform in the field. I'm sure your ML team can tell you that they can anticipate your model to behave in a certain way. they can they can tell you uh, from the get go. So if that's their, I wouldn't say just a hunch. Like if there is some evidence, right, from the clinical trial that the model can behave like this, and that can hurt your business case, then that's your opportunity cost, right? So I think that communication across different function, it's actually how we determine the ROI. Perhaps from the before your pre-market submission, uh, the ML team should lay out how the model, from their perspective, right, based on the concrete evidence during the trial, how the model can, what's the underlying cause of a model can deteriorate. I mean, what's the underlying reason behind it, and how do we set up certain monitoring system or even a PCCP to remediate it, right? I'm sure there will be some discussion across different functions. And I believe that's how you determine the ROI. It wouldn't fit all cases, I would say, for the PCB case. I agree with you completely. There are some instances where PCB does not make sense because the second iteration of the product would be drastically different, right? There will be a limitation to PCCP, um, but if that initial product is, you're betting horse on getting good traction, uh, you got to anticipate the adoption of your
Yeah,
device, and adoption obviously should be monitored, right? And it's just not just a matter of quality regulatory anymore. It does affect your business in many ways.
yeah. And then this may be a PCCP question, but it's not asked that way. It's an interesting question. So this particular question, I guess they're using an LLM to create some interpretation report or whatever from their diagnostics.
Yeah.
The question is around kind of change management. I'm just reading between the lines. I'm assuming they're using, so obviously running a large LLM in-house can be very expensive,
Yeah.
and you generally end up using APIs that are available from general purpose LLM systems, but then you lose kind of version control
Yeah.
management. And
Absolutely.
so the question here is does the FDA have any guidance on how to manage kind of third-party API-based systems that are not uh, designed necessarily for medical device, but are generally acceptable, like an LLM model. If I want to create a bunch of text from my predictions or from my diagnostics.
Not I'm aware of, in fact,
Uh,
just to be honest. I don't think FDA has published anything that's LM related, um, guidance. I know there are some products in the EU market and some Korea market is leveraging LLM as part of their med device. And in fact, there is a MFDS, which is the counterpart of Korea FDA, have published a guidance about it. Um, Not sure about the adoption across other regulatory authorities, but monitoring setup is a big part of it. And like what Abbas is saying, run a in-house LM model is super expensive. So that's obviously not the approach that most companies would like to pursue. But how to confine the open source LM model to ensure that the repeatability, reliability of the model to achieve like that consistent prediction output. I think obviously it's a big challenge, right? Um, Honestly, we have not done any significant like investment or cases that goes into it. We have looked at a few pre-submissions. We have engaged with the FDA on that, but they are not digging into a lot of these detail as much. They most likely just ask a lot of questions, as a lot of evidence for you to provide, and it does not seem like there is a confined like area that that the client feel comfortable like putting in more information to the FDA to judge, right? You know what I'm trying to say? Because
Yeah,
the guidance, if it's an ML guidance, then it's an imaging segmentation tool. It does give you certain boundary, like this is the effort that you need to make. This is the study that you have to do, accuracy, R&R, clinical validation, and that's it. LM, it seems like there are from the risk perspective, you will be
yeah,
coming up with
uh,
a ton of questions. So honestly, we have not done
okay.
any like significant investment on this, or client have not done a significant investment on this. But we're curious about how the regulatory authority would react to it for sure. We're very interested.
Awesome. Okay, there's a few more questions, but we're out of time. So what we'll do is
Mhm.
we'll follow up with individually to answer those questions. Thank you, Andrew, for your time. Thanks everyone who joined for your time. It was a great webinar, and you all have a great day ahead or great evening, or depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Good
Bye.
boss. Bye.